Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another quick film by me, Mr. Morris. And today we're going to be talking about castles, feudalism, and the plague in the Middle Ages. We got 4 words today: fortified, feudalism, fief, and plague. First, I'm going to start out with a very short film on castles. Castles and life in the castle. You're looking at a very fortified castle with a high wall on a hill or a cliff. This is the Motte and Bailey, which was the first type of castle. Hey, look, I just said that. So you're looking at a wooden fence going around with a moat and a small village in the middle. And up on the top of that hill is the keep. That is where the people, up above here, I move this is where the people would stay. This is a hill from which that they would build on top of that. But the problem is fires can burn down wood. And so they replaced it with stone castles to make it more fortified, stronger. And as you're seeing from this picture, fortified is better because this is not going to burn. And those old castles are still around today, many of them. So let's take a quick look at a fortified castle. So as we look, we have a first perimeter here, and we have a moat. Then we have the guardhouse and the gate here. Then we have the next fortified area made out of stone, the main keep where the king and his family live. And then as you look through here, we have a smaller area of people that live in this area, like a small village, but they're not the main village. That's still on the outside where all the farming fields are. And then as you look at the picture, you're looking at these areas here. These are the guard towers where people live, the soldiers. But then again, all of this keeps the community of the king up and running. Location is very important. Early castles were built on hills for height to look down and fight down upon other people, and you could see your attacker. And they were also built places where they could get fresh water, sometimes near lakes and by the sea. Once again, here is that first style with this motte and the bailey, and up here is the keep where people would go and stay during a time of an attack. Inside was where the great king would live with his family in the great hall, and his soldiers would live in the gatehouse surrounding to protect. And as I showed you again, here is another version of a more modern castle that swept over the last couple of years, last several hundred years in the Middle Ages. Let's talk feudalism and what feudalism was. Feudalism is a way of social identity with a king at the top and the vassals, which are more of his family members here down below. Then land was given to knights, and then down below is where the farmers basically did all the work. This was all land driven. The king had hundreds of thousands of acres. He split it up among his family. They split it up among lords that basically would fight, and then they split that up among having low serf or peasants farm, and then they would pay food for protection, and then they would give protection here as they pass along the taxes, and everything comes back up to the king. Let's watch a short film on this.
This is a short video to explain the basics of feudalism in medieval Europe. Feudalism was a political and economic system during the Middle Ages from around the 8th century to the 15th century AD, so it was a system that lasted for many hundreds of years. Feudalism involved 4 levels of society. The king was at the top as he was the leader of the entire kingdom. Beneath him were the feudal lords, also known as nobles or barons, and these were the wealthiest landowners. Following the lords were knights or vassals, and their role was of the fighting warrior, who usually battled on horseback. Finally, on the bottom of society were the peasants or serfs. Peasants were farmers who worked the land, tending to crops and animals. They were the poorest members of the medieval world, but made up the biggest majority of the population. In these 4 social levels, feudalism worked through an exchange of land for protection, money, or food. Let's have a look at this in more detail. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was very unstable due to wars and invasions. The kings were quite weak and struggled to rule their entire kingdom by themselves. The system of feudalism arose as a matter of security for these European kings who decided it would be best to divide their land up so that they did not have to look after such a large area alone. If they strengthened their kingdom, it would then be harder for foreign people to invade. In the feudal system, the king would keep a share of the land for himself. This would be used for his palace and hunting forest, for example. The rest of the kingdom was then divided between noblemen who had been loyal to the king. The size of the land they received would depend on their personal ties with the king and the status of their family. Those lords would then keep some of the land for themselves and divide the rest up between knights of their choosing. In turn, the knights would give some of their portion of the kingdom to peasants who became serfs who were tied to the land and were not free to leave.
And the whole thing was brought together by these small little manors. These manors right here have a lord's house on it, which is usually made of stone, which was fortified and strong. And then we have the village, which makes it up. We have people over here dealing with sheep. Harvesting over here are the peasants farming. We have more sheep and a little village area that kind of sustains everything. And here we have a church in which everybody goes to. And of course, far away in the distance that you can't see is the main castle of the king. And remember, he has hundreds of thousands of acres. So there are a lot of these little villages all around the king's land. And this was called feudalism. And the fief, which you're looking at, is a plot of land given to a lord so that they can manage this land and in turn pay their taxes and food back up to the king. And everybody gave their soldiers to the king in a time of an attack. The king was in charge of the whole thing, and the fief was the land that was handed out. What about the plague? In the 14th century, a plague spread far across Europe. It was also known as the Black Death. What it was were tiny little mites living on rats, diseased rats that were everywhere, all throughout the countryside. And 4 out of every 10 people died. Almost half of Europe died in about 50 years' time because of this widespread plague. Many people felt this was God's way of killing people because he was angry at them. But little did they know that this had to do with rats that had been infected.
Imagine if half the people in your neighborhood, your city, or even your whole country were wiped out. It might sound like something out of an apocalyptic horror film, but it actually happened in the 14th century during a disease outbreak known as the Black Death. Spreading from China through Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the devastating epidemic destroyed as much as 1/5 of the world's population, killing nearly 50% of Europeans in just 4 years. One of the most fascinating and puzzling things about the Black Death is that the illness itself was not a new phenomenon, but one that has affected humans for centuries. DNA analysis of bone and tooth samples from this period, as well as an earlier epidemic known as the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE, has revealed that both were caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague today. What this means is that the same disease caused by the same pathogen can behave and spread very differently throughout history. Even before the use of antibiotics, the deadliest outbreaks in modern times, such as the ones that occurred in early 20th century India, killed no more than 3% of the population. Modern instances of plague also tend to remain localized or travel slowly, as they are spread by rodent fleas. But the medieval Black Death, which spread like wildfire, was most likely communicated directly from one person to another. And because genetic comparisons of ancient and modern strains of Yersinia pestis have not revealed any significantly functional genetic differences, the key to why the earlier outbreak was so much deadlier must lie not in the parasite, but the host. For about 300 years during the High Middle Ages, a warmer climate and agricultural improvements had led to explosive population growth throughout Europe. But with so many new mouths to feed, the end of this warm period spelled disaster. High fertility rates combined with reduced harvests meant the land could no longer support its population, while the abundant supply of labor kept wages low. As a result, most Europeans in the early 14th century experienced a steady decline in living standards, marked by famine, poverty, and poor health, leaving them vulnerable to infection. And indeed, the skeletal remains of Black Death victims found in London show telltale signs of malnutrition and prior illness. The destruction caused by the Black Death changed humanity in two important ways. On a societal level, the rapid loss of population led to important changes in Europe's economic conditions. With more food to go around, as well as more land and better pay for the surviving farmers and workers, people began to eat better and live longer, as studies of London cemeteries have shown. Higher living standards also brought an increase in social mobility, weakening feudalism, and eventually leading to political reforms.
So if you got that, the Black Plague, and finally the end of it with decreasing the population, actually ended feudalism, which would later change the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. Thanks for listening. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you soon.